London fog lay thick upon the city that autumn evening. At 221B Baker Street, Holmes sat idle, craving challenge. Then came the urgent knock at the door. Dr. Elias Thorne, the renowned chemist, found dead at his Whitechapel laboratory. Poisoned, it seemed, by his own hand with a vial of deadly cyanide. Scotland Yard saw a simple suicide, driven by financial ruin. But Holmes saw a link, a faint trace of an exotic chemical in the vial stopper, not matching Thorne's usual compounds. One link in a chain that would bind a killer. The game is afoot. Chapter 1. The first link. I set down these events as they occurred in the thick autumn fog of 1892, when London seemed wrapped in a shroud of coal smoke and mystery. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned steadily in the grate, sending a welcome warmth against the bitter chill that crept through the window frames. The air carried the damp scent of Thames mud mingled with the sharp bite of Holmes' strong tobacco. My friend sat in his armchair, legs stretched toward the flames, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe, the smooth stem cool against his lips. The Stradivarius rested neglected on the table amid scattered chemical tubes and the faint smell of carbolic soap. Mrs. Hudson's brisk knock announced a visitor. Inspector Lestrade climbed the 17 steps, his rough tweed overcoat dripping fog moisture onto the carpet. He entered without ceremony, hat in hand, the cold still clinging to his cheeks. Holmes, Watson, good evening. A chemist, Dr. Elias Thorne, found dead this morning in his Whitechapel laboratory. Cyanide vial in his hand. Suicide, the Yard believes. Debts had ruined him. Lestrade's voice was flat, but his eyes flickered with doubt. Holmes' gaze sharpened, that peculiar light gleaming in his eyes. Yet you are here, Lestrade. Something troubles you. The inspector paced before the fire, boots leaving faint damp prints. Locked room. No struggle. But the wife swears he was planning a breakthrough. And there's a faint residue on his sleeve, odd for a man who supposedly took his own life quietly. I poured hot tea from the silver pot. Its steam rose in comforting curls, though the bitter taste lingered on my tongue when I sipped. Holmes set his pipe aside and rose. We shall see the laboratory at once. The hansom cab rattled through gaslit streets, wheels grinding on wet cobblestones, the driver's whip cracking above the distant toll of Big Ben. Fog horns moaned from the rivers we neared Whitechapel. The laboratory smelled strongly of chemicals, carbolic, faint gunpowder from old experiments, and the unmistakable almond-like trace of cyanide. Thorne's body had been removed, but the scene remained untouched. A single gas lamp hissed overhead. Holmes moved like a shadow, gloved hands tracing the smooth glass of beakers, the rough wooden bench scarred by acid. He knelt beside the workbench, magnifying glass in hand, studying the vial still lying where it fell. The stopper bears a faint white crystalline deposit, not pure cyanide residue. A link. Mixed with it is a trace of reddish clay and coal dust, the exact composition found only near the Limehouse lime kilns and dockyards. The forge, such soil does not appear on Mayfair streets where Thorne resided, nor on the laboratory floor before this morning. I recall the adventure of the engineer's thumb, where a single boot carried hydraulic oil blended with Surrey clay, evidence that demolished an alibi and exposed a gang of counterfeiters. The ground, Watson, remembers every forbidden path, and no man can walk without leaving his history stamped upon his soles. The chain, therefore this vial was handled by someone who came recently from Limehouse, not by Thorne himself. The first link forges, Watson. Did you see it form? The bind. I confess I had not. The listener may smile at my slowness. The link was there. Did you forge it before Holmes? Holmes continued, sniffing the air. Gunpowder scent lingers, recent, but not from this death. He lifted a pair of worn leather gloves from a shelf. Their cracked surface felt rough under my fingers when he passed them to me. Acid burns consistent with heavy laboratory use. Yet the palms are clean. Someone wore them briefly, perhaps to avoid leaving prints. We spoke next with Mrs. Thorne in the small parlor adjoining the laboratory. A weak fire crackled, barely warming the room against the fog's chill. She sat rigid, hands twisting a damp handkerchief. The soft fabric sodden with tears. Elias was worried about money, she whispered. His partner, Mr. Blackwood, pressed him. His assistant Finch was loyal but ambitious. Professor Langford hated him over a patent dispute. Holmes steepled his fingers under his chin. And your nephew, Arthur? He arrived by telegram this afternoon, shocked naturally. Outside, rain began to patter on the roof. We returned to Baker Street as the city clock struck 10, the cab's wheels splashing through puddles. By the fire once more, Holmes reached into the Persian slipper for fresh tobacco, the leather soft and worn. The room filled again with the comforting smell of pipe smoke and coal. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. The first link is forged. Someone from Limehouse handled the fatal vial. Others will follow. The chain has begun. I looked at the dancing flames, the textures of rough tweed on my chair, the smooth coolness of my teacup, and felt the familiar thrill of the hunt stirring. Holmes' methods never ceased to astonish me. What chain would you build from these first observations, dear reader? The first link forged. The chain begins. Chapter 2. Forging connections. The morning after our first visit to the laboratory dawned gray and damp. The persistent fog of London, still clinging to every brick and window pane. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire roared against the chill, filling the sitting room with warmth, and the familiar smell of burning coal mixed with the strong tobacco from Holmes' pipe. I breakfasted on toast and bitter coffee, the taste sharp on my tongue, while Holmes stood by the window, steepled fingers under his chin, watching the hansom cabs clatter past below. Today we forge the next links, Watson, he said quietly. We visit the men and women whose lives touched Thorne's most closely. Each will add texture to the chain. Our first call was to Reginald Blackwood's offices in the heart of the city. The cab rattled over wet cobblestones, the driver's whip cracking above the rumble of wheels. Fog horns moaned from the river as we drew near. Blackwood's sweet smelled of ink, polished leather, and old ledgers. The air was warmer here, heated by a generous fire that crackled in the grate. Blackwood rose from behind his mahogany desk, a tall man in rough tweed, his voice deep and controlled. M.R. Holmes, Dr. Watson. A terrible business about Elias. I heard only yesterday. Holmes sat without invitation, eyes scanning the room. Your partnership with Dr. Thorne was dissolving, I understand. Financial pressure? Blackwood sighed, the leather of his chair creaking as he leaned back. Debts, yes. Elias's experiments were expensive and slow to yield patents. We argued sharply, I admit, but murder, never. He offered brandy. Its sweet warmth slid down my throat, cutting the fog's damp chill that still clung to my coat. Holmes noted a faint white dusting on Blackwood's cuff. Chalk, perhaps? Or something more chemical. Chalk from the billiard room downstairs, Blackwood replied smoothly. I play most evenings to clear my head. I could see Holmes filing the detail away. Listener, the connection seems invisible. Can you see it? We left with little more than polite denials, but Holmes murmured as we descended the stairs. His cuff bore more than chalk. The first small link. Our next destination was Harold Finch's modest lodgings in Limehouse. The journey took us east, past narrowing streets where the smell of Thames mud grew stronger, mingled with fish and coal smoke. Rain began to fall, pattering on the cab roof like impatient fingers. Finch opened his door himself, young, pale, eyes red-rimmed. Gentlemen, please come in. His voice trembled slightly. The small parlor was sparsely furnished. A tiny fire struggled in the grate, giving off more smoke than heat. The damp newspaper by the hearth curled at the edges. Holmes wasted no time. You were Dr. Thorne's assistant for 3 years. Tell us of his final days. Finch sat on a worn leather chair that creaked under him. He was excited about a new compound, something with ferrocyanide derivatives. Said it could change everything. But he grew tired, anxious. He rubbed his hands together. I noticed faint white powder under his nails. Shock again? Holmes asked mildly. Finch started. From teaching evening classes at the Mechanics' Institute, I supplement my income. Holmes' eyes gleamed. And the laboratory mud on your boots yesterday. Reddish clay from the kilns. You live nearby. Finch paled further. I walked there after hearing the news, to see for myself. Listener, what chain would you build from these observations, dear reader? The interview ended with Finch offering weak tea that tasted of old leaves. As we left, Holmes said softly, he knows Limehouse intimately. Another link forged. We pressed on to Professor Victor Langford's residence in Kensington. The fog had thickened again by the time we arrived. Gaslights glowed like blurred moons along the pavement. Langford's house smelled of carbolic soap and exotic chemicals. The warm study lined with leather-bound volumes. He received us standing, a thin man with sharp features. Thorne is dead. Good riddance to bad rubbish. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Rivalry over patents? Outright theft, Langford snapped, pacing before the fire. The flames crackled loudly in the sudden silence. He filed claims on my arsenic-based stabilizer. I confronted him 2 weeks ago. Heated words, nothing more. Holmes lifted a small vial from the mantel. Its glass was cold to the touch. Arsenic compounds still in use? For lectures only, Langford said curtly. Nothing lethal. I tasted the dryness in my mouth. The room felt suddenly stuffy despite the open window letting in damp fog air. Listener, Holmes saw the tension. Did you? Our final visit that day was back to the Thorne household where the maid, Miss Eliza Dunn, waited in the servants' hall. The narrow room smelled of laundry soap and coal smoke from a tiny grate. Rain drummed steadily outside. She curtsied, apron stiff with starch. I serve tea to the master every afternoon, sir. He seemed distracted lately. Did you ever handle the chemicals? Holmes asked. Never, sir. Only cleaned the glassware, wearing gloves always. Her hands fidgeted with a damp cloth. Holmes noted the small calluses on her palms, consistent with frequent scrubbing, but not with delicate lab work. As we prepared to leave, young Arthur Thorne appeared suddenly at the door, coat dripping, face flushed from the cold. Any news, gentlemen? My aunt is beside herself. Holmes studied him. You arrived by telegram yesterday. From where? Brighton. Business for my firm. The sweet smell of brandy lingered on his breath. He had clearly taken a dram for courage. Listener, Watson missed the timing. Did you? Back at Baker Street that evening, the fire burned low. Holmes paced before it, violin in hand, plucking a few mournful notes that mingled with the crackle of coals and the distant chime of Big Ben. 4 interviews, Watson. 4 voices. Yet certain threads repeat. Limehouse mud, white powder, arsenic traces, financial strain. The links are forging. The chain takes shape. I poured us both hot tea, its steam rising in the warm room. The bitter taste grounding me after the day's cold journeying. The smells of tobacco, damp wool, coal smoke, Thames mud carried on our clothes, and the lingering carbolic from Langford's study still clung faintly. Textures abounded. Rough tweed of my coat. Smooth pipe stem Holmes now held again. Cold window pane I touched absently. What chain would you build now, dear reader, from these multiplying connections? Links forging. The chain takes shape. Chapter 3. The chain grows. I confess that by the 3rd day of our investigation, the fog of London had begun to feel like a metaphor for the case itself. Thick, persistent, and reluctant to lift. Yet Holmes moved through it with certainty, as though he could already see the outline of the chain taking form. That morning we returned to Dr. Thorne's Whitechapel laboratory, the hansom cab splashing through shallow puddles, wheels grinding on cold, wet cobblestones. Big Ben tolled 11 as we stepped down. The air carried the heavy smell of Thames mud, coal smoke, and the ever-present damp fog that clung to our coats like a second skin. Inside the laboratory the chill was morgue-like. No fire had been lit since the discovery, and the stone floor struck cold through our boots. Holmes lit the gas lamps one by one. Their soft hiss joined the distant moan of fog horns from the river. The room still smelled strongly of carbolic soap from the police cleanup, undercut by the faint bitter almond trace of cyanide and a sharper note of old gunpowder residue from some long-ago experiment. Holmes knelt at once beside the workbench, magnifying glass in hand. He scraped a tiny quantity of crystalline deposit from the floorboards with the tip of his penknife and held it to the light. This bluish-white powder, not mere dust, potassium ferrocyanide crystals, mixed with microscopic specks of arsenic trioxide. The link, such a combination, is not accidental. It appears only when someone has been preparing or handling synthetic cyanide precursors in an impure environment. The forge. I recall the adventure of the speckled band with perfect clarity. Grimesby Roylock kept a swamp adder whose venom left a faint milky residue on the bell rope ventilator. That single overlooked trace linked the locked room death of Julia Stoner to her stepfather's murderous device. The poison, the mechanism, the greed, all forged into an unbreakable chain by one tiny physical clue the police dismissed as dirt. Here, too, the floor remembers. The chain. Therefore the cyanide in the vial was tampered with before Thorne ever touched it. The link forges stronger. Watson, did you see it before I named it? The bind. I shook my head, chastened once again. Listener, Holmes saw 3 links already. How many did you spot? He moved to a narrow drawer beneath the bench, one we had overlooked on the first visit. It opened with a soft scrape of wood on wood. Inside lay several sheets of foolscap covered in chemical formulae, and one small stoppered vial wrapped in damp newspaper. Holmes unwrapped it carefully. The paper felt sodden and cold against my fingers when he passed it to me. "Examine this under the lens," he said. Even to my untrained eye, the writing on the uppermost sheet showed irregularities. Faint heat induced browning along certain lines, as though invisible ink had been developed after the fact. Invisible ink traces, reactive to gentle heat or certain vapors. Link. The formulae have been altered. The quantities of reagents increased just enough to produce an unstable compound. Forge. Recall the 5 orange pips, where the coded messages hidden in old newspaper columns spelled death for the Openshaw family. Each pip carried the weight of a secret organization's vengeance, but it was the paper itself, the texture, the age, the faint chemical scent, that forged the chain back to the Ku Klux Klan. Here the paper betrays the forger. The chain. Someone returned after the death to plant or alter evidence. Before I explain further, what does this hidden alteration tell you, dear reader? The bind. The laboratory felt suddenly smaller, the gas lamps flickering as though the room itself held its breath. Holmes pocketed the vial and the papers. We ventured next to the city mortuary, a short, handsome ride through streets where rain had begun again, pattering steadily on the cab roof. The morgue smelled overpoweringly of carbolic and wet stone. The cold air bit at our faces and hands. Thorne's body lay beneath a rough sheet on a marble slab, smooth and icy to the touch. Holmes turned back the sheet with care. No obvious wounds, but the nail beds showed a faint bluish discoloration. Chronic arsenic exposure, subtle over weeks or months, not the acute dose of cyanide alone. Link. The final ingestion was staged. Forge. In the glorious Scott affair, the convict's tattooed forearm bore faded prison marks that linked him to a mutiny years earlier. A single coded message in a child's seemingly innocent letter forged the chain that brought justice at last. Here the body itself speaks. The chain. The poisoner knew Thorne's habits intimately. The connection seems invisible. Can you see it now? The bind. Listener. The link was there all along. Did you forge it before, Holmes? We returned to Baker Street as dusk gathered, the fog lamps along the street glowing like blurred moons. Mrs. Hudson had kept the fire burning high. Its warmth was welcome after the cold morgue and the damp laboratory. Holmes stood before the hearth, violin in hand, drawing a few slow, thoughtful notes that mingled with the crackle of coals and the distant chime of Big Ben through the window. I poured strong tea, its heat and bitter taste steadying after the day's grim discoveries. Holmes set the violin aside and reached for the Persian slipper, filling his pipe with fresh tobacco. The rich smoke curled upward, blending with the coal smoke already filling the room. Ferrocyanide tampering, forged formulae, chronic arsenic, staged suicide, he murmured. Each observation a link. Each link connects to the next. The chain grows stronger, Watson. Logic binds tighter with every hour. The smells of the day lingered on us. Tobacco from Holmes' pipe, the damp wool of our coats, faint Thames mud carried on our boots, carbolic from the mortuary, gunpowder memory from the laboratory, leather from the handsome seats. Textures too. Rough sheet on the slab, cold marble, sodden newspaper, smooth glass file, worn violin, wood beneath Holmes' fingers. What chain would you build now, dear reader, from these new connections? The chain grows stronger. Logic binds. Chapter 4. Testing the links. By the fourth day the fog had thinned to a pale veil, yet the chill of early winter still bit through coat and glove alike. At 221B Baker Street the coal fire snapped and hissed, filling the room with welcome heat and the mingled smells of burning coal, strong tobacco from Holmes' pipe, and the faint damp wool that clung to everything we wore. I sipped hot tea, its bitter warmth steadying my nerves, while Holmes paced before the hearth, violin tucked under his chin, plucking a few restless notes that mingled with the crackle of flames and the distant rumble of hansom wheels on the street below. "We have forged several promising links, Watson," he said, setting the instrument aside. "Now we must test them. Weak ones will shatter. Strong ones will hold. Let us begin." Our first test took us back to Reginald Blackwood's offices in the city. The cab rattled over cobbles still slick from overnight rain. Gaslights flickered dimly in the midday gloom. Blackwood received us in his private room, the fire roaring, the air thick with the scent of polished leather and ink. He stood as we entered, his rough tweed jacket creased from sitting. "More questions, gentlemen." His voice carried an edge of irritation. Holmes wasted no words. "Your alibi for the evening of Thorn's death. A dinner at the Chemical Society. We have checked the attendance list. You signed in at 7:30. Yet the telegram you sent to your clerk bears a time-stamp of 8:15, and the postmark is from Whitechapel Station." Blackwood's jaw tightened. "I left early, felt unwell. The telegram was sent from your office here." Holmes continued calmly. "The ink on the form is still fresh enough to smudge under pressure. Forged after the fact, I fancy." Blackwood sank into his chair, the leather creaking. He offered no denial, only silence. "Listener, the first weak link shattered. Did you hear it break?" We departed without further words. Holmes murmured as the cab pulled away. Blackwood's connection was financial, not chemical. He may have pressed Thorn to ruin, but he did not forge the poison chain. Next we called on Harold Finch at the Mechanics' Institute in Limehouse, where he gave evening classes. The building smelled of chalk dust and damp stone. A small fire in the lecture room gave off more smoke than heat. Finch stood at the blackboard, sleeve rolled up, faint white powder visible on his forearms. "You teach chemistry here," Holmes observed. "Yet the powder on your cuff the other day was not chalk. It was potassium ferrocyanide residue, the same compound we found altered in Thorn's laboratory." Finch paled, the chalk in his hand trembling. I assist in small preparations for demonstrations. Nothing lethal." Holmes produced the small vial from his pocket, the one taken from Thorn's hidden drawer. "This bears your thumbprint. Developed under my ultraviolet lamp. You returned to the laboratory after the death." Finch's shoulders slumped. "I only wanted to protect his reputation, to remove any sign of failure in the formula. I never harmed him. The chain held here. Finch was involved, but not as poisoner." Listener, another link tested and held. What would you have concluded? We moved swiftly to Professor Langford's Kensington residence. Rain had begun again, drumming on the cab roof as we traveled. Langford's study was warm, the fire crackling brightly, the air sharp with carbolic and a faint metallic tang of chemicals. He greeted us with folded arms. "Your arsenic compounds," Holmes began. "You lectured on their stabilizing properties 2 weeks before Thorn's death. Yet the chronic traces in his system match the exact preparation you described. Slow, cumulative, tasteless in small doses." Langford laughed once, sharply. "I lecture, Mr. Holmes. I do not administer." Holmes lifted a train ticket stub from the mantel, half burned, but the date and destination clear. "You claim to be in Oxford on the day the final dose was likely given. This stub is from Paddington to Oxford, yet the ticket was never punched. Purchased but not used. You remained in London." Langford's face darkened. He paced, boots thudding on the carpet. "Very well. I stayed to confront him again about the patent. We argued, but I left him alive, swear it." The timeline link weakened. Langford had opportunity, but the method did not fit his impulsive temper. Listener, the connection seemed strong. Did you see it weaken before Holmes named it? We returned briefly to the Thorn household to speak once more with Miss Eliza Dunn. The servants' hall was cold despite the small grate. She stood twisting her apron, the rough starch crackling faintly. "You cleaned the laboratory glassware," Holmes said gently. "Did you ever notice anyone tampering with the cyanide stock?" "Never, sir. I wore gloves always, as the master insisted." Her hands showed the calluses of hard work. No trace of chemical burns. "And young Mr. Arthur Thorn, did he visit the laboratory often?" "Only once or twice. He disliked the smells." Her testimony held firm. No motive, no opportunity. A link that never truly formed. Finally we called at Arthur's club in Mayfair. A brief visit. The doorman's log showing him signed in continuously during the period of chronic poisoning. The sweet smell of brandy lingered in the smoking room. Arthur himself was absent, but the record was clear. His inheritance motive existed, but the timeline absolved him. Back at Baker Street that evening, the fire burned low. Holmes stood before it, hands clasped behind his back, the glow catching the gleam in his eyes. I poured brandy, its sweet burn welcome after the day's cold journeys. 5 suspects tested, Holmes said quietly. Blackwood's alibi forged, but not murderous. Finch's interference post-mortem, not pre. Langford's anger genuine, but his poison too crude for this subtle work. Dunn and Arthur eliminated by access and timing. The weak links have shattered, Watson. What remains is stronger, more tightly forged. The room smelled of tobacco smoke, cooling coals, damp wool drying by the hearth, and the faint echo of carbolic that still clung to our clothes. Textures pressed in. Smooth glass of the brandy snifter, rough tweed of my chair, cold window pane where fog pressed against the glass. Listener, so many threads tested. Which link held strongest in your mind? Weak links shattered. The true chain emerges. Chapter 5. The chain tightens. The 5th day broke with a raw wind sweeping up from the Thames, driving the last ragged wisps of fog before it and leaving the streets slick and gleaming under pale January sunlight. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned fiercely, its warmth battling the cold that seeped through every crack. The room smelled of fresh tobacco, hot coals, and the lingering damp wool of our overcoats hung to dry. I drank strong coffee, its bitter heat grounding me, while Holmes stood motionless by the window, watching the street below with eyes that missed nothing. A telegram arrived at dawn, he said without turning. Blackwood has taken flight. Booked passage on the midnight steamer to Rotterdam. He leaves from the East India Docks tonight. We must move quickly. We hailed a hansom at once. The cab rattled eastward through crowded thoroughfares, wheels hissing on wet cobbles, the driver's whip cracking above the clatter of hooves and the distant bellow of fog horns still sounding from the river. The air grew thicker with the smell of coal smoke, tar, and Thames mud as we neared the docks. Holmes sat silent, fingers steepled beneath his chin, the smooth stem of his unlit pipe cold between his teeth. The East India Docks were a maze of warehouses and cranes, the wind whipping at our faces, carrying the sharp tang of salt and gunpowder from the powder magazine nearby. Stevedores shouted above the creak of ropes and the groan of shifting cargo. The cold bit through gloves and coat alike. We found Blackwood's name on the passenger list of the SS Caledonia, cabin paid in cash, sailing at 11 that night. Holmes moved like a shadow among the shadows of stacked crates. He will not board openly now that he knows we are close. Look there, beyond the customs shed. A tall figure in a dark greatcoat stood half hidden beside a pile of barrels, collar turned up against the wind. Blackwood. He glanced at his pocket watch, then scanned the key with nervous jerks of his head. Holmes touched my arm. We circled wide, keeping to the lee of the warehouses. When Blackwood turned to walk toward the gangway, Holmes stepped into his path. Emma. Blackwood. A word, if you please. The man froze, eyes widening. Holmes. He spun on his heel and bolted. The chase was sudden and brutal. Blackwood plunged between towering crates, boots pounding on wet planks. Holmes pursued with long, tireless strides, coat flapping. I followed as best I could, breath burning in my lungs, the cold air stinging my face. Rain began to fall again, sharp, slanting drops that stung like needles. Blackwood darted down a narrow alley between warehouses, the walls close and dark, the ground treacherous with oil and rainwater. Holmes gained ground. His hand shot out and caught the man's sleeve. Fabric tore with a rough, ripping sound. Blackwood stumbled, swung wildly. His fist grazed Holmes's cheek, drawing a thin line of warm blood that trickled down in the cold. Holmes grappled him to the ground. They rolled once, twice, rough tweed scraping against damp wood. Blackwood's hand plunged into his pocket. He drew a small glass vial, raising it high as though to smash it. No. Holmes pinned his wrist. The vial fell, rolling, unbroken. Holmes snatched it up. Potassium ferrocyanide, Your private stock. The same compound used to adulterate Thorn's cyanide. The stopper bears your thumbprint. Blackwood sagged, breath coming in harsh gasps. The wind howled around us, carrying the smell of wet timber, coal smoke, and the faint almond-like trace from the broken seal of the vial. Rain pattered steadily on the crates above. Back at 221B that evening the fire roared high again. Holmes stood before it, the small vial on the mantel catching the light. I cleaned the shallow cut on his cheek with carbolic-soaked cotton. It stung sharply, the chemical scent mingling with tobacco smoke and hot tea I had brewed. The tampering link is forged beyond doubt, Holmes said quietly. Chronic arsenic administered over weeks, likely in the tea Mrs. Thorne served daily, supplied by Blackwood under guise of business meetings. The final cyanide dose, staged as suicide, prepared with ferrocyanide from his own laboratory to ensure rapid death. Motive: Thorne had discovered Blackwood was diverting funds from their joint patent venture to cover personal debts. The ledger entries were altered, forged in Blackwood's distinctive left-handed slant. I sat heavily in my chair, the worn leather cool against my back. And the Limehouse mud? Blackwood maintains a small private laboratory near the kilns, unknown to Thorne. He went there after the final dose was administered, to prepare the fatal mixture. The clay and coal dust betrayed him from the beginning. Listener, the chain tightens around the quarry. Did you feel it close before this moment? Holmes drew upon his pipe, the strong tobacco smoke culling upward in slow spirals. The room felt warm after the bitter cold of the docks. The crackle of coals and the distant chime of Big Ben through the window were the only sounds. The game is nearly over, Watson. One final link remains to be placed. The smells of the day clung still. Tobacco, coal smoke, Thames mud on our boots, gunpowder from the docks, carbolic on my fingers, the sweet burn of brandy I had taken to steady my nerves. Textures pressed close. Rough tweed of Holmes's torn sleeve, smooth glass of the vial, cold metal of the gasogene, warm porcelain of the teacup in my hand. What would you have done when the quarry ran, dear reader? The chain tightens. No escape now. Chapter 6. Links to the past. The sixth day dawned cold and clear, the first true frost of winter glazing the windows of 221B Baker Street. Inside, the coal fire roared steadily, its warmth pushing back the bite of the air that still carried the faint metallic tang of the docks from the previous night's chase. I woke to the smell of strong coffee brewing on the gasogene, bitter and bracing, while Holmes sat at the table, papers and telegrams spread before him like the pieces of a dissected puzzle. His pipe sent slow curls of rich tobacco smoke toward the ceiling, mingling with the coal smoke and the lingering scent of damp wool from our coats. Blackwood is in custody at Scotland Yard, he said without preamble. But the chain is not yet complete until we understand its full length, how far back it reaches. We spent the morning at the yard, where Lestrade had assembled a small archive of documents at Holmes's request. The interview room smelled of ink, old paper, and the faint carbolic Lestrade always carried on his clothes. Files lay open on the scarred oak table. Their rough pages felt dry and brittle under my fingers as I turned them. Holmes lifted the first telegram, dated 3 years earlier. Here begins the thread. Blackwood and Thorne formed their partnership in 1889 to develop a new stabilized cyanide compound for the dyeing industry. Safe, efficient, highly profitable. Blackwood provided capital. Thorne provided the chemistry. But look at the accounts. The ledgers showed steady withdrawals, small at first, then larger. Holmes traced a finger down the columns, diverted to cover Blackwood's gambling debts at a discreet club in St. James's. Thorne discovered the embezzlement 6 months ago. He threatened exposure unless Blackwood repaid every shilling, with interest. Lestrade whistled softly. Motive enough for murder, but why the slow poison? Because Blackwood needed time, Holmes replied. Time to forge new patents in his own name. Time to transfer assets quietly. Acute cyanide would have screamed foul play. Chronic arsenic, administered in tiny doses over tea during their weekly meetings, would mimic a wasting illness. The final cyanide vial was the coup de grace, staged as despair-driven suicide when Thorne grew too weak to fight. We travelled next to Blackwood's private laboratory near the Limehouse kilns, a small brick building tucked behind a row of warehouses, its existence known only to a few. The hansom dropped us at the gate. Frost crunched under our boots on the path of reddish clay mixed with cold dust, the very soil that had forged our first link. Inside, the air was cold and still, heavy with the smells of chemicals, damp stone, and old gunpowder from discarded experiments. Shelves held rows of stoppered bottles. Their glass gleamed faintly in the weak light filtering through grimy windows. Holmes moved methodically, gloved hands lifting vials, opening drawers. In a locked cabinet, forced open with a thin steel pick, he found a small ledger in Blackwood's hand. Entries detailed the purchase of arsenic trioxide for experimental purposes and potassium ferrocyanide for synthesis trials. Dates matched the onset of Thorne's symptoms precisely. "See here," Holmes said, holding the page to the light. "Weekly deliveries to the Thorne household, disguised as patent samples. Mrs. Thorne served tea to both men during their meetings. Blackwood alone knew the exact timing and dosage. The motive crystallized, not mere greed, but fear. Thorne had drafted a codicil to his will, naming Finch as co-inheritor of the patent rights should anything befall him. Blackwood, facing ruin and exposure, chose elimination over restitution. Back at Baker Street that afternoon, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. Holmes stood before it, hands clasped behind his back, the warmth bathing his face in shifting light. I poured brandy, its sweet burn steadying after the chill of Limehouse, and we sat in silence for a time, listening to the crackle of coals and the distant chime of Big Ben marking 4 o'clock. "The past and present are now one," Holmes said at last. "Blackwood's embezzlement 3 years ago led to Thorne's discovery 6 months ago, which led to the slow poisoning, which led to the staged suicide. Each act a link, each link forged in secrecy and desperation. The chain stretches back across years, yet every segment bears the same unmistakable mark, Blackwood's hand. I thought of the early clues. The Limehouse mud on the vial stopper, the ferrocyanide residue on the floor, the forged formulae in the hidden drawer, the chronic arsenic in the tissues, all now connected, all pointing backward and forward along the same inexorable line. Listener, the chain reaches into the past. Did you feel its full length before this moment?" Holmes reached for his violin, drawing a slow, mournful phrase across the strings. The notes hung in the warm air, blending with the tobacco smoke and the faint echo of frost outside the window, textures pressed close. Smooth glass of the brandy snifter in my hand, rough pages of the ledger still open on the table, cold metal of the gasogene, worn leather of Holmes' armchair. The smells of the day remained vivid. Coal smoke and tobacco in our rooms, chemical sharpness and Thames mud from Limehouse, ink and old paper from the yard, sweet brandy on my tongue, past betrayals, present poison, future ruin, all bound now by observation and reason. The chain was nearly whole, past and present, one unbroken chain. Chapter 7. The complete chain. The 7th day arrived with a sharp, crystalline frost that turned every gas lamp into a haloed star and made the cobblestones of Baker Street gleam like polished steel underfoot. Inside 221B, the coal fire had been stoked high since dawn. Its steady roar filled the sitting room with warmth, and the comforting smell of burning coal mingled with the rich, dark tobacco Holmes drew slowly from his pipe. The air carried also the faint carbolic scent that still clung to my coat from the mortuary, and the sweet burn of brandy left in the decanter overnight. At 10 o'clock precisely, Inspector Lestrade arrived, bringing with him Reginald Blackwood in custody. The man looked haggard, his rough tweed coat creased and mud-stained from the docks, his eyes hollow. Mrs. Hudson showed them up the 17 steps. Blackwood's boots left faint damp prints on the carpet. Behind them came Harold Finch, pale but composed, and Professor Langford, stiff with indignation at being summoned. Mrs. Thorne and young Arthur followed last, faces drawn with grief and uncertainty. Holmes stood before the fire, hands clasped behind his back, the glow catching the peculiar light in his eyes. He waited until all were seated, Blackwood in the armchair nearest the hearth, the others ranged on the sofa and chairs, before he spoke. Gentlemen, ladies, the time has come to lay every link of this chain before you. When complete, it binds one man alone. He began with the physical evidence, voice calm and measured. First, the stopper of the cyanide vial, a faint crystalline deposit. Potassium ferrocyanide mixed with reddish limehouse clay and coal dust. Physical link 1. This soil exists nowhere near Mayfair, where Dr. Thorne lived, nor inside his laboratory before the fatal night. It came from Blackwood's private workshop near the kilns. Physical link 2. The thumbprint on that same stopper, developed under ultraviolet light, is Blackwood's, left when he prepared the adulterated dose. Blackwood shifted. The leather creaked beneath him. Next, the chronic arsenic in Thorne's tissues. Physical link 3. Administered over weeks in the tea served during your weekly business meetings. Mr. Blackwood, the arsenic matches the exact compound in your ledger, purchased for experimental purposes, and delivered to the Thorne household disguised as patent samples. Langford leaned forward, but I lectured on arsenic. Your compound was different in purity and dosage. Holmes cut in. The match is precise to Blackwood's stock. He moved to the timeline. Thorne discovered your embezzlement 6 months ago. Timeline link 1. You began the slow poisoning then, small doses to weaken him gradually. The final cyanide dose came after he drafted a codicil naming Finch co-heir to the patents. Timeline link 2. You staged the suicide that same night, locked room, vial in hand, knowing the yard would see despair over debts. Finch nodded slowly. He told me of the codicil only days before. Holmes turned to the witnesses. M.R.S. Thorne served the tea you brought, Mr. Blackwood. Witness link 1. Finch saw you in the laboratory the week prior, carrying a small case. Witness link 2. Miss Dunn overheard your last argument, Thorne accusing you of ruinous diversion of funds. Witness link 3. Arthur's club log absolves him. Langford's unused ticket proves he argued but did not poison. Langford exhaled sharply. Finch looked down at his hands. Now, the motive links. Motive link 1. You diverted partnership funds to cover gambling debts. Thorne threatened exposure. Motive link 2. You forged new patent applications in your name alone. Motive link 3. Killing him preserved your fortune and silenced the only man who could prove fraud. Blackwood's face had gone grey. He stared into the fire, the crackling coals the only sound for a long moment. And the final connecting link, Holmes said softly. The forged suicide note beside the body. Ink analysis shows it written with your left-handed slant, distinctive pressure and angle. You are right-handed in public, but write privately with the left when hurried or emotional. The note was composed in your Limehouse workshop, carried back, and placed after death. Blackwood's shoulders slumped. The room felt suddenly smaller, the warmth of the fire oppressive. I did not intend murder at first, he whispered, only to weaken him, to buy time. But he grew too ill too quickly. When he confronted me that last evening, threatening the police, I panicked. The cyanide was already prepared. I locked the door from inside, slipped out through the back window onto the flat roof. He never locked it properly, and left the note. Silence fell, broken only by Mrs. Thorne's quiet sob and the distant chime of Big Ben marking the hour. Holmes stepped forward. Every link accounted for. Physical traces, timeline, witnesses, motive, final forgery. The chain is complete. It binds you, Reginald Blackwood, To the murder of Elias Thorne. Lestrade rose, nodding to the constable at the door. Blackwood made no resistance as handcuffs clicked shut. The metal sounded cold and final in the warm room. Listener, the complete chain lies before you now. Did you see every link connect before Holmes laid them out one by one? I poured brandy for those who remained, its sweet warmth a small comfort. The smells of the morning lingered, tobacco smoke culling lazily, coal fire steady, faint carbolic on Lestrade's coat, damp frost carried in on boots, leather of chairs warmed by the hearth. Holmes returned to his armchair, steepled his fingers, and allowed himself the faintest of smiles. The truth, when forged link by link in reason, admits of no escape. Every link here accounted for. The chain complete. Chapter 8. Justice in Chains. The morning following the revelation at 221B dawned bitterly cold, the frost thick on every pane and railing, turning Baker Street into a monochrome etching under a pale winter sky. Inside our rooms the coal fire had been kept burning through the night. Its steady warmth fought the chill that seeped through the window frames, filling the air with the comforting smell of hot coals mingled with the last faint curls of Holmes's tobacco from the previous evening. I drank strong black coffee, its bitter heat scalding my tongue, as Holmes stood by the mantel, examining once more the small glass vial that had sealed Blackwood's fate. A sharp rap at the door announced Inspector Lestrade. He entered briskly, cheeks reddened by the frost, his rough tweed overcoat dusted with tiny ice crystals that melted and dripped onto the carpet. Behind him 2 constables escorted Reginald Blackwood, wrists secured by cold steel handcuffs that clinked softly with every step he took up the 17 stairs. Formal arrest proceedings, Holmes, Lestrade said, voice clipped with official satisfaction. We've the warrant. Murder by poisoning. Willful. Premeditated. The magistrate awaits at Bow Street. Blackwood stood silent in the center of the room, head bowed, the firelight catching the hollows beneath his eyes. His once imposing frame seemed diminished. The rough tweed of his coat hung loosely now, stained with dockside mud and the sweat of his flight. The metallic tang of the handcuffs mixed oddly with the room's familiar scents. Coal smoke, lingering carbolic from my medical bag, and the sweet residual burn of last night's brandy. Holmes stepped forward, calm as ever. Before you remove him, Inspector, allow me to clarify one final point for the record. Blackwood lifted his gaze at last. His voice came hoarse, cracked by cold and defeat. There is nothing left to say. You have the chain. It binds me tighter than these irons. Yet the record must be complete. Holmes replied. The arsenic doses, how were they administered without suspicion? Blackwood exhaled slowly, the breath visible in the cooler air near the door. In the tea. Every Wednesday meeting, I brought a small packet. A new stabilizer for the dye trials, I told him. A few grains stirred in while Mrs. Thorne stepped out for the sugar. He trusted me. Fool that I was, I trusted the poison would be slow enough to hide my hand. Mrs. Thorne, who had insisted on attending this final scene, gave a small, stifled cry from her chair. Arthur placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. The leather of his glove creaked faintly. Lestrade cleared his throat. We've recovered the ledger from Limehouse. Your private entries match the purchases. The forged patent applications are with the Crown's solicitors. The suicide notes ink matches the bottle in your workshop. Every loose thread is tied. Holmes nodded once, and the back window of the laboratory, left unlocked by design. You slipped out after placing the vial and note, descended by the fire escape to the alley, walked to Limehouse to dispose of the remaining arsenic. The reddish clay on your boots completed the circle. Blackwood's shoulders sagged further. I thought, if it appeared suicide, the debts would be written off. The patent's mine alone. I never meant it to end in murder, only to delay him. The constables shifted their weight. One coughed into his gloved hand. The room felt suddenly still. The crackle of the fire and the distant chime of Big Ben the only sounds. Lestrade stepped forward. "Reginald Blackwood, I arrest you in the name of the Crown for the wilful murder of Elias Thorne. You will be taken to Bow Street, then to the Old Bailey. Anything you say." "I have said enough," Blackwood interrupted quietly. He looked at Holmes. "Your chain was unbreakable. I see that now." The constables took his arms. As they turned toward the door, Blackwood paused, glancing back at Mrs. Thorne. "I am sorry," he said simply, "for all of it." She did not reply, only nodded once, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. They descended the stairs slowly, the clink of handcuffs echoing in the narrow stairwell, footsteps heavy on the treads. Lestrade lingered a moment after the door closed behind them. "The Yard owes you again, Holmes. Without your links, we'd have closed it as suicide. Another despairing chemist lost a debt." Holmes inclined his head. "Justice required the full chain. Now it binds as it should." Lestrade touched his hat brim and followed his men. The hansom cab waiting below rattled away into the frosty morning, wheels grinding on iced cobblestones, the sound fading toward the Strand. We stood in silence for a time. I poured fresh coffee, its steam rising in comforting curls, and handed a cup to Holmes. He accepted it without a word, the porcelain warm against his fingers. Mrs. Thorne rose at last. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson," for seeing the truth when no one else could. Arthur helped her into her coat. The rough wool rustled softly. They left quietly, footsteps retreating down the stairs, the front door closing with a final soft thud. The room settled into its familiar hush. The fire snapped. Tobacco smoke drifted lazily. The cold pressed against the windows like an uninvited guest kept at bay. Holmes set his cup aside and reached for his pipe, filling it thoughtfully from the Persian slipper. The leather felt worn and soft under his fingers. "Every loose end explained," he murmured. "The criminal bound. The innocent cleared. Justice at last served. Listener, the irons have closed. Did you feel the weight of the final link fall into place?" The smells lingered richly, coal smoke steady in the grate, tobacco curling upward, faint carbolic on my hands, the sweet ghost of brandy from the night before. Frost-damp wool from coats hung to dry, textures pressed close. Smooth porcelain of the coffee cup, rough tweed of the armchair, cold glass of the window where I stood watching the street empty once more. The chain had done its work. London's fog would lift in time, but the truth it had hidden was bound forever. The criminal bound. Justice served. Chapter 9. Links restored. The trial of Reginald Blackwood opened at the Old Bailey on a gray February morning in 1893, when the frost still clung to the stonework of the court, and the breath of every soul in the public gallery hung visible in the chill air. I sat in the witness box 2 days later, the rough oak rail cool beneath my palms, the smell of polished wood and old paper mingling with the faint coal smoke that drifted in whenever the heavy doors opened. Holmes had been called the day before. His testimony, delivered in that calm, precise voice, had laid the chain before judge and jury link by link, leaving no room for reasonable doubt. Blackwood sat in the dock, diminished in his dark suit, eyes fixed on the floorboards as the prosecution read the indictment aloud. The courtroom echoed with the rustle of legal papers, the scratch of pens on foolscap, and the occasional cough from the spectators bundled against the cold. When the foreman rose at last to deliver the verdict, guilty of murder, a low murmur ran through the room like wind through fog. Blackwood did not flinch. Only his hands tightened on the rail, knuckles whitening. The judge, in his scarlet robes, pronounced sentence with measured gravity: death by hanging. Blackwood was led away between two warders, the clink of irons faint but unmistakable as they descended the stairs to the cells below. The metallic sound lingered in my ears long after the doors closed. Outside the court the air tasted sharp with frost and coal smoke from the city beyond. Holmes waited for me on the pavement, collar turned up against the wind, pipe already drawing. We walked together toward Ludgate Hill, hansom cabs clattering past, their wheels grinding on iced cobbles. MRS. Thorne will receive the patent rights in full, Holmes said quietly. The codicil stands. Finch is named co-executor. The Crown has already confirmed no claim will be made on the estate for Blackwood's debts. I nodded, relieved. And Finch himself? Already at work in the laboratory. He intends to complete Thorne's stabilized compound, properly this time. No more hidden ledgers. No more diverted funds. Mrs. Thorne has offered him a partnership share, a fitting restoration. We paused near St. Paul's, its dome rising pale against the winter sky. The frost on the railings glittered like scattered diamonds. My breath clouded before me. Holmes drew deeply on his pipe, the strong tobacco smoke curling upward to join the thin haze of city coal smoke. Arthur Thorne has returned to his firm in the city, Holmes continued. No state attaches to him. His uncles will provide for a modest legacy, enough to secure his future without the shadow of suspicion. He visited Mrs. Thorne yesterday. She spoke of forgiveness, of moving forward. The innocent had been cleared, their names and futures restored by the same inexorable logic that had bound the guilty. I thought of Finch's pale face in the witness box, steady as he described Thorne's final experiments, of Mrs. Thorne's quiet dignity when she testified to the weekly teas and Blackwood's frequent visits, of Arthur's relief when the club log was produced, proving his absence during the critical weeks. London itself seemed to breathe easier in the days that followed. The fog lifted at last, revealing sharper outlines to the gas lamps and the river. Hansom cabs moved briskly through streets no longer choked by mist. The cries of newsboys carried farther on the cold, clear air. At 221B, the sitting room felt lighter. MRS. Hudson had opened the windows to air the place, letting in the crisp scent of frost and distant Thames mud, instead of the heavy tobacco and coal smoke that had dominated for weeks. One afternoon, Mrs. Thorne called, bringing a small parcel wrapped in plain brown paper. She sat by the fire, its warmth welcome against the lingering chill, while Holmes accepted the gift with a slight bow. A token, she said softly. Elias's favorite blend of tobacco. He always said it cleared the mind for difficult work. Holmes opened the packet. The rich, dark aroma filled the room at once, blending with the coal smoke and the faint carbolic still on my hands from a morning's surgery. A generous gesture, madam. I shall honor his memory with every pipeful. She smiled faintly, the first true smile I had seen from her since that grim night in Whitechapel. The laboratory is open again. Finch begins proper trials next week. The patent will bear both their names, Elias's and his. Justice, in its way, has been restored. Arthur arrived shortly after, coat dusted with frost, cheeks pink from the walk. He shook our hands warmly. The leather of his gloves felt cold but firm. Thank you, gentlemen, he said, for seeing what no one else could. My aunt speaks of returning to a quieter life, perhaps the country. I shall look after her interests here. They left together, footsteps fading down the 17 steps, the front door closing softly behind them. Holmes stood at the window, watching their figures disappear into the street. Order returns, he murmured. The chain that bound the guilty has also freed the innocent. The city moves on. I poured hot tea, its steam rising in comforting curls, its bitter warmth steadying after the emotional weight of the trial. The fire crackled. Big Ben chimed the hour in the distance. The room smelled richly of fresh tobacco, steady coal smoke, frost-damp wool drying by the hearth, and the faint sweet trace of brandy from the tantalus. Textures pressed close. Smooth porcelain of the teacup, rough tweed of my chair, worn leather of Holmes' armchair, cold glass of the window where frost still traced delicate patterns. Listener, the innocent walk free once more. Did you feel the balance restored when the last shadow lifted? London's streets resumed their familiar rhythm, gas lamps flaring at dusk, hansom wheels rumbling over cobbles, the distant moan of fog horns from the river now only occasional. The mystery had ended. Truth had prevailed. Order restored to London streets. Chapter 10. By the fire at Baker Street, several weeks had passed since the black cap was placed upon the judge's head at the Old Bailey. Reginald Blackwood had met his end at Newgate on a raw March morning. The newspapers carried only brief notices, as though the city itself wished to turn the page quickly. At 221B Baker Street, the sitting room had settled once more into its familiar rhythm. The coal fire burned steadily in the grate, casting a warm golden glow across the worn Persian rug and the scattered chemical apparatus on the side table. Outside, a light spring rain pattered against the window panes. Inside, the air smelled richly of fresh tobacco from Holmes' pipe, hot coals, and the faint sweet trace of brandy warming in the talus. I sat in my usual armchair, legs stretched toward the fire, a cup of strong tea balanced on my knee, its bitter heat comforting after the chill of the street. Holmes lounged opposite, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in that peculiar attitude of reflection he adopted when the hunt was over and the mind turned inward. His Stradivarius rested across his lap. Every so often he plucked a single, slow note that hung in the warm air like a question left unanswered. Mrs. Hudson had just cleared the supper tray, cold beef, bread, and a wedge of sharp cheddar, leaving behind the lingering scent of mustard and the comfortable clink of china being carried downstairs. The 17 steps had echoed with her retreating footsteps. Now only the crackle of the fire and the distant chime of Big Ben marked the passing hours. Holmes spoke at last, voice low and thoughtful. The case of the chemical trace evidence, Watson, offers an almost perfect illustration of the method I have spent a lifetime refining. Every mystery begins as a tangle of impressions: mud on a boot, residue on glass, a forged slant of ink. Most men see only the surface. The untrained eye collects facts without forging connections. But observation, true observation, selects the significant detail and forges it to the next, link by link, until the chain is unbreakable. He reached for his pipe, drawing deeply. The smoke curled upward in slow spirals, blending with the coal smoke already filling the room. In this affair, the first link was that faint crystalline deposit on the cyanide stopper, potassium ferrocyanide mixed with limehouse clay. A trivial speck to Scotland Yard, yet it pointed unerringly to a second workshop, unknown to the victim. That single trace connected to the chronic arsenic in the tissues, which connected to the weekly tea meetings, which connected to Blackwood's ledger of embezzled funds. Each observation, standing alone, was meaningless. Joined together, they formed an iron chain no alibi could break. I nodded, remembering the cold mortuary slab, the bluish tint beneath the nails, the way the pieces had seemed to fall into place only after Holmes named them. It reminds me strongly of the Red-Headed League, he continued, eyes gleaming with that peculiar light. There, too, a seemingly absurd advertisement concealed a deeper plot. But the key was the soil on the knees of the trousers, clay from a country lane mixed with city soot. That one detail forged the chain to the tunnel beneath the bank. The criminal had forgotten that the ground remembers every step, just as Blackwood forgot that chemicals remember every hand that touches them. In both cases, the deception was elaborate, yet undone by the simplest physical truth. Observation defeats deception because nature does not lie, only man does, and he does it clumsily. He set the violin aside and leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. The science of deduction is nothing more mysterious than disciplined attention. Eliminate the impossible, and what remains, however improbable, must be the truth. But elimination requires data, 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 data. In this matter, we gathered traces from boots, stoppers, ledgers, tissues, even the slant of a hurried hand. Each datum was a link, reason the forge, the complete chain the proof. When you train yourself to see, not merely to look, the world becomes a vast ledger of clues waiting to be read. I sipped my tea, feeling the familiar admiration stir once more. And yet, Holmes, the public will never fully grasp it. They see the result, the arrest, the confession, the verdict, but not the patient forging of each connection. Precisely, he replied. That is why I leave the chronicle to you. You record not only the solution but the method, the slow, relentless building of the chain. Readers may follow along, link by link, and perhaps learn to spot one or two themselves before I name them. It is the best education against deception that exists. He rose and crossed to the window, looking down at the rain-slick street where a lone hansom cab splashed past beneath the gas lamps. The light caught the droplets on the pane, turning them to tiny prisms. "London will forget Blackwood soon enough," he said quietly. "Another crime will fill the columns, another puzzle will demand solution. But the chain we forged remains, a reminder that truth, once properly linked, admits of no escape." He turned back to me, a faint smile touching his lips. "Until the next chain begins to form, Watson, the game, as ever, continues." I raised my cup in silent salute. The fire crackled. Rain drummed softly. Tobacco smoke drifted. The warmth of the room wrapped around us like an old friend. "Listener, the chain is forged, the mystery closed, the truth laid bare. Did you follow every link as it formed, or did one or two surprise you even at the end?" The smells of the evening lingered. Rich tobacco, steady coal smoke, faint carbolic from my medical bag, sweet brandy warming nearby, rain damp, wool drying by the hearth, textures pressed close, smooth porcelain of the teacup, worn leather of the armchair, rough pages of my notebook where I had scribbled the final notes, cold glass of the window where spring rain traced slow paths. The city outside moved on, gas lamps flaring, hansom wheels rumbling, fog horns sounding distantly from the river. Inside 221B, two friends sat by the fire, one satisfied, the other already recording. Until the next chain forges, dear listener, the game continues.